All right, so I have 12:30. Welcome to our webinar, The Value of Manure in 5 Stories. We have 3 excellent speakers today. Quirine Ketterings, Professor of Nutrient Management at the Nutrient Management SPEAR Program, Department of Animal Science at Cornell University. Quirine Ketterings joined Cornell University in the fall of 2000 to provide leadership for the Field Crops Nutrient Management Extension and Applied Research Program. She is the most productive researcher at Cornell because of her open and collaborative nature, forward thinking, hands-on approach, and great work ethic. She has provided important information for New York growers through collaborative research projects hosted by New York farmers and conducted with the help of cooperative extension field staff, postdocs, and grad students. Our second speaker is Kirsten Workman, the Nutrient Management and Environmental Sustainability Specialist at Cornell with PRODAIRY. Kirsten joined PRODAIRY in 2022. Prior to joining PRODAIRY, she spent 20 years working with farmers in Washington and Vermont, helping them improve the nutrient management and environmental sustainability of their farm businesses. She's an experienced extension educator and enjoys working with all facets of the dairy industry to demonstrate and evaluate conservation cropping systems that benefit farms and the environment. And our last speaker of the day is Juan Carlos Ramos. He's the on-farm research coordinator for the Nutrient Management SPEAR Program. He collaborates in building on-farm research partnerships with farmers, private and public sector farm advisors, agricultural industry, and state agency partners to advance nutrient management for field crops in New York. With that, I want to turn it over to our speakers for the day.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to dive straight in. The title of our presentation here, Value of Manure in 5 Stories. The slide on the screen here gives you an idea of what those 5 stories might be about. We have one story about injection of manure, alfalfa grass fields, a story about incorporation, mixing of manure with chisel versus shallow mixing, a story on the direct seeding of corn after manure injection, a story on side dressing of standing corn, and then the carryover benefits of corn to alfalfa, so manure use under corn years, the benefits under the alfalfa years that follow. And then Juan Carlos will be talking about our current Value of Manure project and our invitation to participate. Before we dive into this though, the first reference here, the first reminder here is to recognize a couple of basic things about manure itself.
Yeah, so, I think we all understand that manure is very important and valuable to our cropping systems. I like to call it an organic soil amendment. But basically, right, it contains all 17 essential nutrients. And we're not going to dive deep in this today because we want to share with you sort of the more practical applied stories of this presentation. But basically, right, for both the phosphorus and potassium, we assume that all of that in the manure is available as fertilizer. And then when we get into the nitrogen management, we sort of have the 2 fractions in dairy manure. There's the inorganic or available nitrogen that behaves more like our fertilizer. It's very readily available for plant uptake. And we talk about this a lot in this story because if we don't incorporate it in the spring, we start to see losses. So you'll see the theme through all of these stories is trying to really maximize that inorganic portion of the manure nitrogen. And then we have the organic nitrogen, which slowly becomes available to the plant. And the current values we use is 35% of that organic nitrogen is available in the first year, 12% in the second year, and 5% in the third year. And I will just say, as you can see there in the upper right, like calibration and manure sampling are really important pieces to this puzzle to understand what is the value of your manure. So then you can manage it and plan for it accordingly.
So let's dive straight into those stories now. The first one, injection of manure in alfalfa grass fields. This is a research project that came on board because of 2 really practical questions. Will application of manure increase my yield of alfalfa grass stands? And is there any negatives associated with injecting in those hay fields? Does injection reduce yields due to mechanical damage of the root system? This is a project we collaborated on with Scott Potter of Dairy Sports Services several years ago. We had 4 treatments. One was no slicing, no injection, no manure. So that was the control. Then we had this down, no manure, where the injector was in the ground, but there was no manure being added. The fourth treatment is injection, just a regular injection pass, and the fifth is surface application of manure. In the picture you see now, you see sort of the visual of what that looked like. This down, no manure, and no manure on the two pictures on the left are basically where we compare injection versus no injection without manure, and on the right it was injection compared to surface application of manure. We had two locations, the Aurora Research Farm and the Cornell University Ruminant Center at Hartford, New York. In Aurora, we had an alfalfa stand and a tall fescue stand, and both of those were examples of run-out old stands where manure was applied after first cutting. First year we did it at 4,000 gallons, second year 8,000 gallons. And then the tall fescue, similar type of applications, first and third cut with 4,000 gallons, and again 2015 the year after. Remember from the Aurora research stands, grass and alfalfa fields, old stands. At Hartford, it was a full-fledged production field, much higher yielding environment. Manure was applied after fourth cutting in 2014, also at 4,000 gallons, and then again 8,000 in the second year. Here's a picture of what that looked like in Aurora and at Hartford. The pictures are actually reversed. The old stand in Aurora is on the right, and the better one is on the left at Hartford. The first year we did 4,000 gallons with this unit, a vein house injection unit. And we had this unit on loan and could go as low as 4,000 gallons with this application. The second year, we did not have that unit on loan anymore. We had it on loan from the ARS lab in Pennsylvania. Second year, we worked directly with Scott on his equipment, bigger size. So I had to adjust a little bit our plot sizes there, but this was the equipment that was used for the second year of application. So the first thing we want to look at is the difference between with and without manure. So here you see Aurora, the 2 years of data. Remember, after first cutting was the application, and then again in 2015. What I want you to focus on, we harvested 1, 2, 3, 4 cut systems, depending on the season. And what I want you to focus on is the circles at the end there, the totals, where you see little A's behind the manure treatments and little B's behind the no manure treatments. This is basically signaling that the manure addition itself increased the yield, oftentimes doubling or more than doubling the yield. And it happened every year. And both of those locations, tall fescue as well as alfalfa. Systematic benefit of manure applied to these older stands. In Hartford, there was no benefit of the manure per se. It didn't harm anything. It didn't benefit anything either in terms of yield. And this is a good stand, much higher yields than in the previous location. Looking at this comparison is, did we actually harm the stand by injecting, by having injection equipment run through the sod? We have this comparison of disc down, where the injector was in the ground, versus disc up, where the injector was not in the ground, versus disc down, where it was in the ground. And what we see is a collection of little A's. No difference. Not for any of the sites, not for any of the years. It didn't matter if it's alfalfa or grass. The basic conclusion here is the injector itself did not harm the stand. So the glycine did not benefit or harm any of the stand. So the summary and conclusions for this one, for the older stands, manure drastically increased yields, both for hay and alfalfa, regardless of the application method. But higher yielding alfalfa, no yield benefit from the manure, but it was also no yield penalty from injecting either. The results suggest that injection can be implemented without negatively impacting yield in hay crops. There's an extension article. I posted a link here that we published on this research in the past, where if you want to see more detail, you can check it out. And with that, we're on story number 2.
Awesome. So we get out of some of our perennial crop systems and into our annual crops, and we're constantly talking about incorporation and more we talk about injection, but we also want to just share that, you don't have to be high tech to get your manure incorporated, and you don't even have to be 6, 8, 10, 12 inches down. So this just shows a comparison of these two toolbars, the chisel there on your left and an aeration toolbar, often called an airway or a gentil on the right, that just sort of pokes and does a little bit of fracturing, but not much disturbance. And we did compare those to also surface applications. So you can see there on the left that the aerator does much less soil disturbance, leaving more surface residue. So that this is, you can see there's more corn stubble on the surface than with the chisel, which we'd expect. But in both situations, we got the manure incorporated into that soil profile fairly well. And what we saw, if you want to go ahead and go next, the results of that was that in both aeration and chisel gave us a yield benefit over a surface application, which is what we would hope to and expect to see by utilizing more of that ammonium nitrogen in our manure by getting it incorporated. We see much less loss. So where our surface applications were hovering right around 19 tons per acre, both the airway or aerator and chisel plots were closer to 20. And we saw that too in milk per acre as well. And if you might notice, if you go to the next slide, that there was site 2, 5, and 6, we didn't see that yield. And so even though we applied and used more nitrogen in that crop, we didn't see yield benefit. Well, the corn stalk nitrates test that was done at the end of season that gives us sort of a report card of what was the nitrogen status of that field in general. Remembering that if you get over, let me take a step back. But these 3 sites all had CS&Ts over 5,000 parts per million. So once we're over 2,000, that's considered excessive, and that we had more than enough nitrogen out there. So that is likely why we didn't see that yield benefit. And so when you take that out of the equation, we see more like a 2 ton per acre yield increase versus the 1 when you take those 3 fields out of the averages. But just to say that in fields, especially fields that need a little bit of nitrogen, incorporation is definitely the way to go. And I think, yep. So, the other takeaway home from this is that shallow incorporation is a suitable method for getting our manure incorporated in our reduced tillage systems. So if there was no difference between the chisel plow and the aeration toolbar, right, we would rather see less disturbance, more residue on the surface. And we think we can accomplish that, right? We have reduced fuel and time investments. We get better surface residue cover, better soil health benefits, while still increasing that yield by 1 to 2 tons an acre by getting that nitrogen in the manure incorporated into the soil.
And with that, we're on story number 3. And the third story here was based on the question, can I just seed directly after manure injection? Or do I need another tillage pass to prepare the seed bed prior to seeding? And this was corn related as well. So this was a research trial conducted out in Western New York, farm with a big focus on soil health management. We had tillage depth studies from 2012 to 2013, followed by reduced tillage intensity studies comparing reduced tillage no-till to reduced tillage practices between 2014 2016. The 3 words you see here, NT, RT, RT plus, are no-till, reduced tillage with aerator but no zone tillage, and then intensified reduced tillage, which is an aerator plus a zone tillage. And we have some of our parameters that we measured here. If we just zoom in on the yield, the silage yield, we see for the zone tillage depth that there was no need to go to deeper depths. There was no need to do the zone tillage. Now, this result was different from the very first time this farm tested this, a decade before that or even more. And it reflected years of soil health focused management. So in the year that we tested this, there was no need to go with zone tillage and deeper depths, definitely. So the years after that, we started looking at this comparison of no-till planting versus using that aerator without the zone builder versus aerator with the zone builder, to see if we could skip those tillage passes, save ourselves some fuel, capture some carbon, and retain some carbon. And what we see here across these years that we did these studies was also no difference among treatments. All three of them were around 23 tons of corn silage per acre, suggesting that we really could plant directly after manure injection.
And I just wanted to add that that works really well for our cereal grains and cover crops too. So the pictures in front of you, the farm went through and injected their fall manure in some pretty heavy soil in September. It was dry, as you can see, but then went ahead and drilled their cover crop right after. And you can see there in the middle picture, that's about a month after planting. You can still see so the winter rye is planted in the straight rows as you're looking at it, and you can see the manure injection going diagonally across it where that manure was. And then just another, month and a half after that into November, we start to see those drag lines disappear, and the cover crop clearly is growing really well. And you can see, if that's what your cover crop looks like in November, you're doing a pretty good job. And so that field is able to get manured and planted with 2 passes and no additional tillage in between.
All right, so our Western New York site where we had the different tillage practices, basically the findings reflected more than 10 years of zone tillage combined with cereal winter cover crops, soil health focus. Direct planting in this project did not impact yield, negatively impact yield, the quality of silage. Results suggested that reduced tillage and no-till can both be viable options to intense tillage for this farm that project was done on. The conclusion statement here, when farms have made significant efforts to adopt soil health practices, manure injection followed by no-till planting without further seedbed preparation or zone building did sustain yields and conserve nitrogen while reducing soil disturbance and the risk associated with nutrient loss from that, as well as reducing tillage associated fuel, equipment, and labor cost. We're not saying that this applies to every farm, but this was a good example of a farm where on-farm research showed that they could go with direct planting and save on fuel and time and labor equipment costs.
So Quirine, I have a question. So the injection, was that a disc or a knife? And then how deep was it set? And did it matter the depth versus the rate that you're putting through it, like 4,000 gallons versus 8,000 gallons?
Yeah, so I'm reading off the screen here. It's been a little while here. This is a picture on the right of that manure injector. Chisel sweep tools, zone tillage depth in behind the manure tanker. So this was not a drag hose system. It was a tanker at that time. If I need to guess this off the top of my head, it was about 6 inches. Aerated plus zone tillage, 7-inch depth. 2 fields, multiple years.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. On to the next story.
Awesome. So side dressing of manure in standing corn. So while not new, I would say it's newly evolving. I'm actually at another conference today in Vermont where we're hearing about some additional work that's been done in this area. And I have a few pictures from a colleague out in Ohio. And I just want to say there's multiple benefits here, right? So if we can be getting manure out in the summer, we are maximizing the nutrient value by applying it to an actively, vigorously growing crop like you see here. And more now we're understanding how that might also impact our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can get manure out of our storages in the warmest months of the year, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from our manure storages. And so for lots of reasons, this is becoming more and more interesting, and I think we'll see more and more work. And so you can see here, this was sort of a pilot project that it's still kind of ongoing. And so Doug Young's nutrient boom is what's pictured there. And you can see they're going into pretty tall corn. What is that, shoulder high about, Quirine? That they're going into, and have hoses that then dribble down along the ground. I think the next slide has a picture of what that looks like. So you can see that those hoses are now dribbling. This is just a straight up surface application, right? And so how is that? We always talk about don't apply on the surface, don't apply on the surface. Well, because we have that canopy closure, right? We're also avoiding some of that ammonia loss and volatilization by applying down underneath the canopy and side dressing right when that's when corn's growing inches, right, a day, and really taking up all that nutrient. So if you go to the next slide, you can see this was a drag hose, so not for the faint of heart, right, to have this kind of equipment on hand to be able to pull that hose out between the rows, and we can't be dragging, right, the drag hose over the corn at this point. We do have pictures of that when you're earlier, but that would definitely be the end of your corn crop. So having these equipment where we can sort of dolly along the drag hose with the manure application equipment, so you can be going in straight rows up and down, and then moving further down the fields. And so in 2015, this project started, thanks to some innovative farmers who were really trying to figure out some cool things. The timing, this was looking at a timing of application study, and it showed that this one-time application at this point in the season was sufficient for them for their, other than starter, I believe, nitrogen needs for that crop. So then in 2016 and 2017, the project focused on then comparing this to nitrogen rate trials. And this is really where our now bigger value manure project got started. And I think we have here, so this was in a field that was corn grain. It hadn't seen a lot, if any, manure in previous years. And this is how the study was laid out. And thanks to the farmer who also, I think, is he a pilot? Someone got this great aerial photo. This is before drone. I don't think it was a drone. I think it was an airplane. You can see the three arrows pointing to where the 3 strips of manure went, and then laid over across all of the strips, both manured and non-manured, we had various rates of nitrogen side dress. So that was to get at, what is the benefit of the manure, but we need to also understand how that worked in terms of, how much nitrogen was available to the crop and how does that compare to the fertilizer. And what's really interesting in the middle there, sort of behind the barn, you can see a 0 rate of nitrogen in a manured strip and the full 175 rate of fertilizer. And even just visually, you can see that manured strip is doing far better than the plot next to it. And the results bore that out. If you want to show those next. So you can see here, this was the first year that the corn that received manure got no additional yield benefit from applying nitrogen fertilizer. So we were up there around 180 bushels of corn grain, regardless of the rate of nitrogen application. Where next to it, we see a more typical curve we see when we do nitrogen rate trials. So no manure, but just nitrogen. We start to see, some benefit as we up the nitrogen application rate up to about 100 units of nitrogen, and then it levels out. That's pretty typical. So then what was really interesting about this study is this difference between the yellow line with no manure, but fertilizer, and the manure. Not only did that corn not need the fertilizer, but it out yielded the fertilizer plots in general. And so that was really interesting. So they repeated the study again. In 2017, different year, they also did 2 different hybrids just to see if that had a role to play in both the manured and non-manured plots, but they basically, slightly lower yields overall, but saw the same result where we start to level out at about 100 units of nitrogen fertilizer. Saw a little bump from the manured plots here and there, but generally I don't think it was significant statistically. And we still see quite a big jump there in the total overall yield in the manured plots, regardless of nitrogen. So we see that there's some yield benefit from the manure itself that's not necessarily dependent on the nitrogen. And that, that's pretty interesting. And it really helped us figure out how do we credit our manure, and is there any additional benefits above and beyond nitrogen, which I think we all sort of inherently know, but how do we quantify that? And so you'll hear about a project from Juan Carlos where we're trying to do a much bigger version of this study so we can better understand and better credit those manure nutrients in the future, because we have not updated the way we credit nitrogen in particular from manure in a couple decades anyway.
One thing to add to those two, this was a citrus application, middle of the season,
Yeah.
where the solid content of the manure was fairly low. And in 2016, we thought, well, maybe this bump in yield is because we sort of irrigated the plots, and it was an extremely dry year. But in 2017, it was extremely wet, and we saw the same results. So this is not a water response. There's something else going on here that, and not just a nitrogen response, that shows the benefits of manure in terms of a yield bump, not related to moisture, not related to nitrogen.
Yeah. And I'm biased. I think it's because it's magic, but that's okay. So ongoing work, right? We understand that it makes sense that, doing better timing with our manure applications, we're going to see better results, but that is limited, right, by the kind of equipment we have available to us. So that nutrient boom that you saw in the pictures that were related to that study was a prototype. They're frankly still working out the kinks a little bit, so it's not commercially available yet. So can we take commercially available equipment like the grassland injector you see in wheat there, or the drag hose injector in the corn above it? Is there ways we can sort of adapt our existing equipment to be top dressing and side dressing our crops in season? And so these are two examples from Ohio State University and Glenn Arnold's work. He's been working on this since 2006. And here's some more examples. In corn, I think that one on the right is the same field as the one before. You're just seeing the back end. So in this situation, we're getting the manure not only applied in season, but also injected, which again is going to bump up our nitrogen utilization and efficiency. And on the left, what we're starting to see farms do, I have a couple farms, and actually over the last 2 days, I'm hearing from more and more farms where this is becoming a more common practice to be surface applying our liquid manure on top of corn after planting and even after emergence. And if you look closely at those pictures, it's a little frightening to see that corn laying on the ground as the drag hose rolls against it, right? And for anyone who's ever tine weeded corn, it's like, I don't know, my heart skips a beat and I stop breathing a little bit. You're like, what did I just do? But however, it pops right back up if you can do it early enough. And one comment I actually just had with a producer this morning was, this works way better in no-till fields than it would where you have loose soil and that drag hose might pull soil up and over the crop. So just word of warning there. But we are looking more into these situations. Again, getting manure out in season and really utilizing it to the best extent possible. So again, right, side dressing means we don't have to be on fields when it's too wet and nutrient losses can be really high. So we can be out in fields. It opens up our window for manure application, which are always tight, especially if you're relying on the help of custom operators. These trials show that side dressing liquid manure can increase yield above what we can achieve with fertilizer alone, and in most cases eliminate the need for fertilizer altogether, and really shows the value of manure. And also, right, that we have further development of technology needed. This side dressing piece, we talked about not being currently available in that taller corn crop. That's still fairly true, but I think we're starting to understand how we can use existing pieces of equipment and sort of get scrappy and use what we've got on hand as well.
All right, and that we have reached our fifth story. The fifth story is about the benefits of manure to the crop following the crop that you applied it to. So carryover yield benefits of manure applied on the corn years for the alfalfa or alfalfa grass years that follow. This is a busy slide, but it's basically a summary of 5 years of following the alfalfa stand after 5 years of corn. Under the corn years, we had implemented treatments, and the blue treatments were compost applications at 2 rates. The green treatments were liquid manure applications to meet nitrogen needs and phosphorus removal. And then the yellow and red bar on each of these charts are the fields that did not receive manure and that were fertilized either with nothing or with 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre under the corn years. So we did that for 5 years. And then we turned it over into a alfalfa field and started following the alfalfa yields. In 2006 was the establishment year. It was a challenging year. 2007 was a drought year that really cut yields across the board. We only got about 3 tons in both of those years, with 2 cuts in 2006 and 3 cuts in 2007. And then 2008 came along and we thought, okay, finally a decent growing season. So 2008, 2009, and 2010 were reasonable growing seasons. And this is where you really started seeing the benefits of manure. So the color straight, the blue charts here and the green ones are the ones that received either compost or manure under the corn years. And in 2008, all of those, independent of the rate, out-yielded the fields that had not received any manure or compost under the corn years. And as you see this, you see the stand run out after 5 years, lower yields, but still the composted fields and the fields with the manure at the higher rates were out-yielding the lower, the fields, the yellow and the red bar on the right that did not have that manure history. So what this slide is showing us is that there is value of manure. That's not just for the year in which you apply it, but it's also for the years after that, with tremendous yield benefits, several tons all accumulated over those 3 years difference when manure was applied, compost was applied versus where only inorganic fertilizer had been applied. Not related to nitrogen, not related for phosphorus, potassium. All of that was in sufficient amount available. And this shows the benefit of manure for many years after the last application took place. Last application was in 2005. There's a summary article on this as well. But basically, manure compost applications can have significant impact on the crop yields for the years to come after that. We do need to get the rates right to reduce the risk for nutrient loss in a year of application. And we will have to figure out better ways of knowing actual application rates, nutrient contents as we are applying manure. Kirsten already mentioned in the opening slides there, calibration is really important. If we have a good sense of what we apply where, at what rate, how much nitrogen is in it, and how much can we credit, we have a much better chance to manage it appropriately over time to reduce losses.
And you have a question, Quirine, from Aaron Gabriel asking about the manure during corn and subsequent years to alfalfa. Were those alfalfa stands pure alfalfa or a mixture of alfalfa and grass?
They started out as pretty much pure alfalfa stands and quickly turned into a mix.
Maybe because of the manure.
It was not because of manure. We did do
Okay.
a mix assessment, and the prior manure treatments in the corn years were not influencing the composition of the stand. But
Awesome.
that is a possibility. Yeah, thanks for that, Aaron. All right, with that, we've covered our 5 stories, and I'm going to hand it over to Juan Carlos to talk about our current activities in terms of value of manure.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Quirine. And we're going to start this talking about 2 grants that we got last year. One of them from New York Farm Viability and one from Northern New York Agricultural Development Program. And with this fund, we have the opportunity to work with farms and do what we did during the studies in 2016 and 2017 that Kirsten talked about, and try to see what is the nitrogen benefit and the yield benefit of manure application. So we started this project the past year, and it's an ongoing project right now. So what we are doing is pretty much the same that we did in 2016 and 17, the same plot, the same kind of plots and trials. And we are recreating the application of 3 manure strips. Here are the ones with darker green. And then we subdivide those strips into 6 different substrips that receive 6 different nitrogen rates, from 0 to 175 in the case of this farm. And this is how we are doing it right now. Before planting, we apply 3 manure strips. Those strips are between 1,200 and 1,800 feet long, and they are between 50 and 60 feet wide. And we leave a space in between those 3 strips to another 3 no manure strips. So that's a space that doesn't receive manure. And then at side dressing time, we subdivide the 6 strips into 6 substrips that receive the different nitrogen side dress rates. In the case of this farm, between 0 and 192 pounds of nitrogen. I'm gonna now jump into the results of 2022. We had 3 farms, 2 of them in central New York, 1 in northern New York. And here I have a graph for the yield. And we have pairs of columns. On red are the plots that didn't receive manure, on gray the ones that did. And then the different rates between 0 and 175 pounds of nitrogen at side dress time. And for this farm, we can see that each pair of columns have almost the same yield. So we didn't see a yield response due to the application of manure. And then if we see across the different nitrogen rates, we see that it's also a flat line. And that means that there was no response to the application of manure. So between 0 and 175, there was no yield increase due to inorganic fertilizer application. So the conclusion for this one is that we didn't have a yield response for nitrogen fertilizer or manure application. Then moving to the second farm, here we saw a different behavior for the application of yield and nitrogen. We see that for each pair of columns, the ones on red, the no manure ones, are lower than the ones on gray, meaning that the application of manure had an impact on yield, and they are consistently higher, the ones on gray. So that means that the application of manure increased yield, but also between the 0 and the 150 pounds of nitrogen rates, we didn't see a response to the application of nitrogen, meaning that this field didn't need extra nitrogen application. So the quick conclusion for this is that there was, in average, a 1.5 ton per acre increase of yield due to the application of manure, but there was no response to the application of nitrogen fertilizer. So this jump wasn't due to the nitrogen in manure. And moving to our last plot, in this farm, we also saw something different. If you see each pair of columns, we see that the manure ones on gray are a little bit taller, and that's a response to the application of manure versus no manure. For example, in 0, you see that it's a little bit higher the yield. But then also when we move between the nitrogen rates, we see that there is an increase. If you focus only on the red columns, you see how they start to increase when we increase the nitrogen application rate. So there was a response to both manure application and nitrogen application. And then we use this data and run some quick economics to be able to calculate the most economical rate of nitrogen, MERN. And this is pretty much the maximum economic return for application of nitrogen. And in this case, the MERN for no manure, we have it in the black line, was 56 pounds of nitrogen for a yield of 29 tons per acre. And then when we compare that to the red line, that's for the no manure plots, we see that it needed more nitrogen, in this case 114 pounds, to yield 28.5 tons per acre. So that gives us to this conclusion. There is a difference of 58 pounds of nitrogen per acre between the manure and no manure rates, and that's the amount of nitrogen that the application of manure was worth. And then we also saw a yield increase of 0.5 tons per acre between manure and no manure. So for this farm, we saw a yield response to nitrogen fertilizer and a response to manure application. And with this, we moved to an invitation for our 2023 project. We are looking for farm participants to have the exact same trials. We have more information on our website, and these are just a great opportunity to test the effect of manure application in your farm, and also to compare the effect of different nitrogen rates. We ran manure samples, soil samples, corn stalk nitrogen tests, and silage quality samples. We have a flyer here, and I'm gonna highlight the part where Andy Miller from Osterhout Farms says that this study helps us put a number on the value of manure. It was very easy to implement without taking my time away. He did drag housing, and then he did some tilling to the incorporation of manure when we did this in his farm. So with that invitation, and if you need more information, please reach out to any of us, and I'm gonna hand it back to Dr. Quirine.
So in terms of the invitation, thanks, Juan Carlos. We are not restricted to a particular manure source or application rate or timing. This could all be designed with the farm specifically. We want to build a database with different manure sources. So if farms want to participate with liquid dairy manure, separated solids, separated liquids, poultry manure, it doesn't really matter. All of those sources are of interest in this project to reevaluate and try to figure out our current crediting systems. Do they need to be fine-tuned for different manure sources that we are working with now? That might not be all the same as it was 20 years ago when the crediting system was developed. This was basically the end of our 5 stories and our invitation for people to participate. The Value Manure Story project has other components to it. That includes looking at value manure calculators and bringing in an economic component to handling manure as well. So we're building our network right now of partners in this project to move the research forward. Quick wrap up on the presentation before we leave about 15 minutes for people to ask questions and to have a discussion. Is that the reminder, the manure has all essential nutrients. It's actually a really good slow release fertilizer source. It keeps giving. It keeps giving not just for the year of application and the weeks after you apply it, but also for the years after that. Our first story showed that manure injection can be implemented without negatively impacting hay crops. The second study showed that shallow incorporation is as effective as incorporating manure and capturing nitrogen as more aggressive tillage is, with the obvious benefits of reduced disturbance of the soil itself. The third study showed us that we could implement no-till planting directly after manure injection. So we could save ourselves a tillage pass, particularly on this example of a farm that had emphasized soil health management for over a decade with cover cropping and zone building. The fourth study showed that manure can increase, or the fifth study showed that manure can increase yield for years after the last application, beyond what could be achieved with fertilizer. And that is also what we were seeing in terms of the 2022 farms, 2 of the 3 farms that Juan Carlos talked about. With that, we want to remind everybody of one more thing that we completely ignored in all of this. And that is with manure, you gotta make sure that you avoid compaction. That is a core message for everything. Drag hosing is a great way to go. Might be other approaches that could help us in that direction too. Here's a list of our funding agencies and the organizations that are involved in that were involved in the various projects and involved in the current projects. I want to thank all the farmers that participated in those projects and that actually generated the many questions that we did research on as well. Our contact information is there as well. And with that, we open it up for questions.
There's a couple of questions from Mike, just, it's one question really about some technology from Yield 360. It's called 360 Rain. That's an autonomous liquid applicator in standing corn, and wondering if we might be looking at that as well as other tools being used.
We currently are not specifically looking at that, but we're really interested in looking at any of those technologies that are out there that can help us move forward with more efficient nutrient management.
Yeah, and so especially if you have like a producer that's doing something like that, or they're demoing something, you know, we'd love to see that and see, you know, if there are ways we can help quantify the impact of that. But definitely. We have another question about calculating how many pounds of P or K you're applying in manure per your manure sample, and what percentage of those nutrients applied are available in the crop, to the crop in the current cropping season. So right now we consider 100% of the P2O5 and K2O from your manure sample that's applied to the field is available to your crop that year. And so we don't have sort of a, you know, multi-year credit to that, because we're able to soil sample. And so we can apply what is needed based on the soil test, and those soil tests are based on sufficiency levels. So if you're low, it might suggest you need more than, you know, to help keep and build soil test P high. And then if you're into the high and excessive, well, we know you don't need quite as much. But when we're making those calculations, we consider them 100% available.
That brings up a good aspect. The manure project that Juan Carlos talks about, we have those 3 strips where manure is being applied. Our part of the protocol is to get manure samples during that application, so we can properly characterize how much was applied and how much NP and K was in it.
Yeah.
So many growers will get a manure analysis for NP and K. In this particular set of studies, are you going to go further and get sulfur numbers as well as other macro and micronutrients?
Right now we are focusing on nitrogen, but we are also grabbing the fertility, soil fertility samples, and we are trying to see if there is an effect on other nutrients, but our main focus at the moment is nitrogen.
Our manure analysis do include sulfur though, so we do get those numbers. I had to teach a class here on campus just before this session, and it was the sulfur class today. So you do some quick calculations of the amount of sulfur you would be removing in our typical crops, hay crops, corn silage, corn grain. Typically somewhere between 10 and 20 would capture most of the fields, maybe up to 30 if we have high yielding areas, 30 pounds of sulfur per acre. And a regular manure application will quickly satisfy the sulfur needs for that crop that year.
In fact, we have a fact sheet about that. Maybe Juan Carlos can find the link and put it in there.
Yeah, we have a new fact sheet on the sulfur value of liquid dairy manure. That came from the question, like we all recognize the air has been cleaned up over the last decades. We have less sulfur deposition. The average number for New York now is less than 4 pounds of sulfur per acre. If you compare that to crop removal of somewhere 10, 20, 30 pounds maybe, start recognizing that we do really have sulfur deficiencies in New York, specifically for alfalfa crops that are big consumers of sulfur, and that we can take care of some of those needs with manure applications.
We have another question from Mike, a good one, about whether or not we've looked at manure constituent mapping from John Deere, and what do we think it's out there but not really being used. So yes, it is out there. We actually have one unit here in New York State with a custom applicator, and there's one in Vermont with a custom applicator that I did a lot of work with before leaving there. So they are out there.